page 42. Better Never to Have Been, David Benatar, 2006. The Harm of Coming into Existence. Chapter 2. Why coming into existence is always a harm. 2.5. The asymmetry of pleasure and pain. However, this conclusion does not follow. This is because there is a crucial difference between harms, such as pains, and benefits, such as pleasures, which entails that existence has no advantage over, but does have disadvantages relative to, non-existence. The term a non-existence is multiply ambiguous. It can be applied to those who never exist and to those who do not currently exist. The latter can be divided further into those who do not yet exist and those who are no longer existing. In the current context I am using a non-existence to denote those who never exist. Joel Feinberg has argued that the not yet existent and the no longer existent can be harmed. I embrace that view. What I have to say here applies only to the never existent. Consider pains and pleasures as exemplars of harms and benefits. It is uncontroversial to say that number 1, the presence of pain is bad, and that number 2, the presence of pleasure is good. However, such a symmetrical evaluation does not seem to apply to the absence of pain and pleasure, for it strikes me as true that number 3, the absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, whereas number 4, the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. Now it might be asked how the absence of pain could be good if that good is not enjoyed by anybody. Absent pain, it might be said, cannot be good for anybody, if nobody exists for whom it can be good. This, however, is to dismiss number 3 too quickly. The judgment made in number 3 is made with reference to the potential interests of a person who either does or does not exist. To this it might be objected that because number 3 is part of the scenario under which this person never exists, number 3 cannot say anything about an existing person. This objection would be mistaken because number 3 can say something about a counterfactual case in which a person who does actually exist never did exist. Of the pain of an existing person, number 3 says that the absence of this pain would have been good even if this could only have been achieved by the absence of the person who now suffers it. In other words, judged in terms of the interests of a person who now exists, the absence of the pain would have been good even though this person would then not have existed. Consider next what number 3 says of the absent pain of one who never exists, of pain, the absence of which is ensured by not making a potential person actual. Claim number 3 says that this absence is good when judged in terms of the interests of the person who would otherwise have existed. We may not know who that person would have been, but we can still say that whoever that person would have been, the avoidance of his or her pains is good when judged in terms of his or her potential interests. If there is any, obviously loose, sense in which the absent pain is good for the person who could have existed but does not exist, this is it. Clearly, number 3 does not entail the absurd literal claim that there is some actual person for whom the absent pain is good. One could, logically, make symmetrical claims about the absence of pleasure that, when judged in terms of the potential interests of a person who does or does not exist, this absence of pleasure is bad. However, number 4 suggests that this symmetrical claim, although logically possible, is actually false. I shall defend number 4 later. For now my aim has been only to show that 3 is not incoherent. In support of the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4, it can be shown that it has considerable explanatory power. It explains at least 4 other asymmetries that are quite plausible. Skeptics, when they see where this leads, may begin to question the plausibility of these other asymmetries and may want to know what support, beyond the asymmetry above, can be provided for them. Were I to provide such support, the skeptics would then ask for a defense of these further supporting considerations. Every argument must have some justificatory end. I cannot hope to convince those who take the rejection of my conclusion as axiomatic. All I can show is that those who accept some quite plausible views are led to my conclusion. These plausible views include 4 other asymmetries, which I shall now outline. First, the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4 is the best explanation for the view that while there is a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, there is no duty to bring happy people into being. In other words, the reason why we think that there is a duty not to bring suffering people into existence is that the presence of this suffering would be bad for the sufferers, and the absence of the suffering is good, even though there is nobody to enjoy the absence of suffering. In contrast to this, we think that there is no duty to bring happy people into existence because while their pleasure would be good for them, its absence would not be bad for them, given that there would be nobody who would be deprived of it. It might be objected that there is an alternative explanation for the view about our procreational duty as a one that does not appeal to my claim about the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4. It might be suggested that the reason why we have a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into being, but not a duty to bring happy people into existence, is that we have negative duties to avoid harm but no corresponding positive duties to bring about happiness. Judgments about our procreational duties are thus like judgments about all other duties. Now I agree that for those who deny that we have any positive duties, this would indeed be an alternative explanation to the one I have provided. However, even of those who do think that we have positive duties, only a few also think that amongst these is a duty to bring happy people into existence. It might now be suggested that there is also an alternative explanation why those who do accept positive duties do not usually think that these include a duty to bring happy people into existence. It is usually thought that our positive duties cannot include a duty to create lots of pleasure if that would require significant sacrifice on our part. Given that having children involves considerable sacrifice, at least to the pregnant woman, this, and not asymmetry, is the best explanation for why there is no duty to bring happy people into existence. The problem, though, with this alternative explanation is that it implies that in the absence of this sacrifice we would have a duty to bring happy people into existence. In other words, it would be wrong not to create such people if we could create them without great cost to ourselves. Or even in its presence, if it is not thought to be great enough to defeat this duty. Just how great must a sacrifice be to prevent a positive duty arising is a complex and hotly disputed matter that I shall not consider here. There are not a few people who think that the extent of the sacrifice that can be required of us is quite considerable. See, for example, Singer, Peter, Practical Ethics 2nd ed. Cambridge University Press, 1993. Notice, by the way, that although Peter Singer's conclusions about the extent of our positive duties are radically counterintuitive, that counterintuitiveness is not usually thought to suffice as an argument against his position. Curiously, though, there is much less hesitance to treat my conclusions as a reductio of my argument. I shall say more about this in Chapter 7. But this presupposes that the duty under discussion is an all things considered duty. However, the interests of potential people cannot ground even a defeasible duty to bring them into existence. Put another way, the asymmetry of procreative, all things considered, duties rests on another asymmetry, an asymmetry of procreative moral reasons. According to this asymmetry, although we have a strong moral reason, grounded in the interests of potential people, to avoid creating unhappy people, we have no strong moral reason, grounded in the interests of potential people, to create happy people. The condition that the moral reason, or duty, be grounded in the interests of the potential person is an important one. Those who find plausibility in the claim that we have a reason to create happy people tend to be motivated by impersonal considerations such as there being more happiness in the world. But these are not considerations about the interests of the potential person. Jeff McMahon says that the view that there is no strong moral reason to cause a person to exist just because his life would contain much good is deeply intuitive and probably impossible to dislodge. The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, New York, Oxford University Press, 2002, 300. It follows that although the extent of the sacrifice may be relevant to other positive duties, this is moot in the case of a purported duty to bring happy people into existence. There is a second support for my claim about the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4. Whereas it is strange, if not incoherent, to give as a reason for having a child that the child one has will thereby be benefited, it is not strange to cite a potential child's interests as a basis for avoiding bringing a child into existence. In other words, it is odd to suggest that one can have a child for the child's sake. If having children were done for the purpose of thereby benefiting those children, then there would be greater moral reason for at least many people to have more children. In contrast to this, our concern for the welfare of potential children who would suffer is a sound basis for deciding not to have the child. If absent pleasures were bad irrespective of whether they were bad for anybody, then having children for their own sakes would not be odd. And if it were not the case that absent pains are good even where they are not good for anybody, then we could not say that it would be good to avoid bringing suffering children into existence. Thirdly, support for the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4 can be drawn from a related asymmetry, this time in our retrospective judgments. Bringing people into existence as well as failing to bring people into existence can be regretted. However, only bringing people into existence can be regretted for the sake of the person whose existence was contingent on our decision. This is not because those who are not brought into existence are indeterminate. Instead it is because they never exist. We can regret, for the sake of an indeterminate but existent person that a benefit was not bestowed on him or her, but we cannot regret, for the sake of somebody who never exists and thus cannot thereby be deprived, a good that this never-existent person never experiences. One might grieve about not having had children, but not because the children that one could have had have been deprived of existence. Remorse about not having children is remorse for ourselves as a sorrow about having missed childbearing and child-rearing experiences. However, we do regret having brought into existence a child with an unhappy life, and we regret it for the child's sake, even if also for our own sakes. The reason why we do not lament our failure to bring somebody into existence is because absent pleasures are not bad. Finally, support for the asymmetry between number 3 and number 4 can be found in the asymmetrical judgments about a. distant, suffering and b. uninhabited portions of the earth or the universe. Whereas, at least when we think of them, we rightly are sad for inhabitants of a foreign land whose lives are characterized by suffering, when we hear that some island is unpopulated, we are not similarly sad for the happy people who, had they existed, would have populated this island. Similarly, nobody really mourns for those who do not exist on Mars, feeling sorry for potential such beings that they cannot enjoy life. That most people do not even think about the absent lives on Mars is itself revealing. Once forced to think about these issues, some will claim that they regret absent Martian pleasure. Whether or not they do, I cannot see how one could regret it for the sake of the non-existent Martians who would otherwise enjoy that pleasure. It is curious, However, how some people will begin to say that they do feel sorry for the absent Martians once they realize that not doing so supports asymmetry, and thus the conclusion that coming into existence is always a harm. However, saying this and its making sense are two different matters. Yet, if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars but that Martians were suffering, we would regret this for them. The claim here need not, but could, be the strong one that we would regret their very existence. The fact that we would regret the suffering within their life is sufficient to support the asymmetry I am defending. The point is that we regret suffering but not the absent pleasures of those who could have existed. Page 47.